Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my NACL Playoffs Round 1 overview and analysis video. Been really excited to get into the playoffs here, obviously. I missed the final week of the season, which was really unfortunate timing, but like I said in the previous video, we knew it was coming. I was going to be out of town for that week, and so I missed at least one video in every single region. I do apologize for that, but I wanted to make sure I was back here for when things really started to kick up here in the playoffs, and I'm going to cover all of the round 1 series in this video. It's a little bit awkward timing because of just how close a lot of these games are together. Round 1 and then round 2 and losers round 1 are basically all happening in the same weekend. I will only be covering winners round 1 in this video. I will be covering the rest, obviously, of all of the games in the playoffs, but I'm going to do that a little bit later in the week. There will be 2 videos for each, just because I want to make sure I get this video, what am I talking about, out on time, you know, before a lot of the stuff really starts to kick off. I don't want to overload one video for the playoffs, and so today we will be covering the first 4 series in winners round 1, upper bracket round 1, which is, of course, all of the playoff teams at the current moment, and I'm really excited to do so. A couple of kind of surprises, teams going in a couple different directions in the last, you know, week of the season that maybe a lot of people weren't anticipating, and so some matchups that I don't think a lot of people were expecting going into the playoffs, and I'm really excited to get into them. But of course, let me know what you guys thought of these games down in the comments section below. I love hearing you guys' feedback. Always love getting in touch with the community. You guys probably aren't going to have the exact same opinion that I'm going to have in terms of predictions and where I think these teams are going to go, and so would love to hear your opinions down in the comments section below. And without further ado, let's go ahead and kick it off here. If you're new to the channel, what we do here is we're going to go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I will be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series, and then at the end of the week, I'm going to preview the upcoming matchups. Now, it's going to be a little bit less because I'm actually recording this on Monday, and so we've actually already gotten winners round 2 happening. I watched those games already, and so I'm not going to spoil a ton in this video. It's not really intended to be like that. The schedule is just kind of jam-packed in terms of, you know, getting this content out, and so I'm not going to go super in-depth in terms of predictions, but throughout this video, I'm going to be giving you guys an idea of where I stand with a lot of these teams, and I think that will give you a pretty good indication on where I think things are going to be going moving forward. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the action. Our first series of the NACL playoffs here in summer is going to be a matchup between the number 1 seeded Team Liquid Challengers and the number 8 seeded Maryville University, and pretty predictably, this was a 2-0 win for TLC. Now, first and foremost, a little bit of a plug. Down in the description right now is going to be a link to my Twitch. You can go ahead and give that a follow. We did a watch-along for this series on that channel, doing some commentating along the way. If you want to get some immediate reactions from me when it comes to some of these NACL videos, I am doing a lot of watch-alongs, especially for the playoffs on that Twitch channel, so go ahead and give it a follow if you are interested. But this series was really interesting, I think, to watch. Team Liquid was definitely the big favorite going into it, but Maryville was one of those teams that at least at one point this year was looking relatively interesting. They were kind of more intriguing than what they ended up being. Now, they really struggled down the back half of the split. They really, you know, kind of fell back down to earth, if you will, after a pretty good week 2 and 3 stretch, especially, that I would say got them in the conversation for being one of the more intriguing teams in the NACL. They just ended so poorly, and because of that, they landed the number 8 seed. It looked for a while like they were going to get a better seed than that moving into the playoffs, but it wasn't meant to be, and Team Liquid's a very tough challenge to have to face in round number 1. They weren't able to overcome it. Team Liquid was definitely the better team in this series, and I think you can point to a lot of players for that. There were a lot of players that I think were just straight up better in this series on the side of Team Liquid, and I feel bad to say that for Maryville, but there aren't really a lot of teams that can mechanically go toe-to-toe with a team like Team Liquid. My player of the series is going to go to Bradley in the top lane. Thought he was really phenomenal across this entire series. Almost Flame Horizon Niles in game number 2 on the Fiora. Very intriguing strategy for Maryville. I actually really like the Aatrox pick in game number 1. I felt like it does relatively well into the Jax, can, you know, do a little bit more in team fights than Jax is necessarily known for, and just creates a little bit of a numbers advantage, and Niles was really good in game number 1, but game number 2, they blind picked the Aatrox because of how good Niles was in that first game, and they get punished for it. The Fiora comes out from the side of Team Liquid, which is going to be much better into the Aatrox so long as you do repost the correct thing, and that was absolutely the case. Bradley dominated the laning phase. He was really able to take over the game, and even on the Jax in game number 1, he still was incredibly incredibly good. He was the best player in this series for Team Liquid, although I did think it was relatively close because Harry deserves a big shout out. Man, he's just so consistent at being able to deal large amounts of damage when you give him resources. I know that there's kind of a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths for Harry because of, you know, just kind of generally how he played in the LCS. He wasn't necessarily awful, but certainly wasn't one of the more interesting mid laners in the league, but I think a lot of that was team dynamic, and I talked about it at the time. He was taking a major secondary role on that team. He basically got no resources and was constantly being asked to give up prio in his lane to go help out the rest of his team, which is just not something that I think you want a young player who's already a little bit inexperienced at that level to be doing for the rest of the team. Getting a chance to come back down here to the NACL, I think it's really shown that mechanic-wise, he's just as good as any other mid laner at this level, and definitely deserves to still be considered one of the more interesting mid lane prospects in North America, even if it didn't necessarily work out for this iteration of the main roster Team Liquid team. He was awesome in this series, was dominating get back in lane. It felt like he was up 30, 40 CS at every point in time across this entire series. I pointed it out so much on the live stream. Obviously, on Jace, it's a little bit more expected, but, you know, LeBlanc into Azir, very LeBlanc favored, but still 30, 40 CS, like, that's really, really good. He was moving around the map, picking up kills, just a very, very good performance coming in from Bradley and Harry, the two solo laners. Arrow was fantastic in this series. Loved him on the Ziggs in game number 1. Really like to see this team start to expand their champion pool like that a little bit. They've been picking the Ziggs, not only the Challengers team, but the main roster as well. It's mostly been going mid lane, though. They've been picking it alongside the Tristana, pretty traditional double flex, but a lot of times it's actually Arrow who's going to be taking that Tristana. So to see that he is going to be able to pick up the Ziggs, I think is a good thing. Jinx, obviously, we know he can play at a good level. Kim Down was great this series, a lot of really good engages, and Mir, as per usual, is just so far ahead of every jungler he goes into in terms of pathing and pressure. He's basically up 10 CS every single game and up a full level. That's just how Mir operates. He's really, really good at the game of League of Legends, and so really good series from Team Liquid, although I guess it's not really all that surprising to hear me say that. And then for Maryville on the other side, just kind of a tough challenge in your first round matchup. You really just weren't skilled enough to be able to go up against Team Liquid. You kind of just got outplayed basically across the board. The only players that I think weren't necessarily completely outplayed in this one, Niles in the top lane had a really good game number 1, a significantly worse game number 2, was definitely outplayed in that second one, but that's pretty traditional what Niles has been offering over the course of this whole split. He'll have, you know, best of 2 series where he is really good in one game and really bad in the other. Just kind of the thing that we've gotten from Niles over the course of this split up until this point. Get Back was super far down in lane, and, you know, he's also had some good and some bad moments. I've been a little bit higher on him towards the middle part of the split rather than, you know, when the split started, but I still don't think he's going to be able to go up against a player like Harry all that consistently. Scary Jerry was relatively fine. He was certainly not making any sort of mistakes, but only so much you can do as like a Varus and a Zaya when the rest of your team is lost as hard as they have. And Zyko tried to engage, tried to make some plays, but was also caught out quite a bit. My dud of the series, though, is going to go to Odd Orange in the jungle. I really like Odd Orange. I think he's probably been the best player on Maryville over the course of this split, in my eyes, in terms of consistency. There's definitely been games where it's like so obviously Niles, or so obviously Get Back, or so obviously Jerry or Zyko. But I think when you're looking at game-to-game consistency, I think they play a lot through jungle. And I think Odd Orange definitely propagates that quite a bit. Unfortunately, he was going into Mir this series, which is always going to be a little bit of a problem, and it just felt like he was completely outclassed. The Sedge and the Vi, neither game was particularly good. That's why he's going to get done of the series. I think it was a little bit more noticeable. I think Get Back definitely deserves an honorable mention for this, but for me, I'm going to give it to Odd Orange in the jungle. Maryville is not out, though, just because they lost in round number 1. Nobody is eliminated in winners round number 1. There is a loser's bracket here, and so Maryville's going to be dropping down into that loser's bracket, that lower bracket, if you will. Not going to freak out about them. This is a team that has been struggling quite a bit recently, though, and I really do believe that if they play at the level that they've been playing at over the past 3 weeks or so, there's probably not a huge chance that they're going to be able to win a series in the playoffs. So hopefully, I know this loss to Team Liquid's not really going to be a big confidence builder, but you got to be able to put it behind you and move forward. And then for Team Liquid, really nice win. This is a team that really should not be running into any trouble in round number 1, but there are a lot of really good teams in the NACL. This is probably the last easy series that they're going to have for the rest of the year. And then moving on to the second series of round number 1 here, and this was the first round matchup that I think I was most looking forward to. Two teams that have very much proven to be interesting at the very least in terms of being able to compete with the top teams. We had the number 4 seeded Cincinnati Fear taking on the number 5 seeded Wildcard Gaming. and Fear is going to be able to take the 2-0 series win. They ended out the regular season with a 2-0 win over Wildcard, and they took that momentum into beating them again here in round number 1 in the playoffs. Massive win for this Fear team. They have really, really ramped up, I think, as the split has gone on. They were struggling at the beginning of summer, and I know that does feel like a memory at this point, certainly not something that is currently impacting the team at all. I think we were all a little bit concerned that maybe some of the changes just weren't going to be as kind to Fear. We all said that the talent level of the region really went up with the teams going down. That's just naturally how it ends up going. The bottom teams in the league are significantly more competitive than, say, the number 16 or 17 team from last split, and Fear looked like they were going to be a team that was struggling a little bit. But even through all that, Shochi in particular was playing really well. I thought Perry had a good start to the split, and game after game after game, everything has started to click more and more and more. I talked about this a lot at the beginning of the split. It felt like they lost a lot of the aggression and the confidence that they were playing with towards the end of last split. Really, when you look at their playoff run that I think shocked a lot of people in spring, a lot of it was because they really just weren't playing with a lot of fear. They were taking, pun actually not intended, just realizing it when I say it out loud. Kind of funny though. They were playing with a lot of aggression, but they were playing the way that they wanted to play. They went for everything that they thought of, and they trusted themselves to be able to make it work. And that kind of confidence in the buy-in of all 5 players on that team is what really made them so difficult to beat, in my opinion, in spring. Obviously, you have to have the talent to be able to back that up, but talent's never really been the question for the players on Fear. We know that they are talented enough to be able to compete with anybody in the NACL, and as this split has gone on, it feels like that confidence, that aggression has definitely been rebuilt, and it's stronger than ever. This was a fantastic performance from Fear against a good Wildcard team. Let's not take that lightly. Wildcard's not a pushover of a team, and they've beaten them 4 games in a row now. Really, really good stuff from Fear. Player of the series pretty much has to go to Shochi in the mid lane for this one. Pentakill in game number 1 on the Jace. A pretty good game in game number 2 on the Yone. He was the standout member of Fear in this series, and for my money, he's been the standout member for Fear, and not just Fear, basically in all of the NACL this split. If you ever had any questions about whether or not Shochi was next up in the mid lane, in my opinion, I think they have all been answered this split. And I know I've been very vocal about how much I've liked his play over the course of 2023, but I mean, it's undeniable at this point. He's been consistently able to win against basically any other mid laner in the region, including some of the best ones. We saw his matchup against Team Liquid with APA, and we're seeing him go up against a player like Saligo here. We've seen him beat Ryelma. We've seen him beat basically every mid laner in the region consistently. Spyrax is another player that he's done very well against. Shochi has just been the guy for Fear over the course of this split, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way towards the rest of this team. We will get to them in a second, but in terms of carry potential, it's just really kind of been a breakout split for him. And, I've talked about this a lot over the course of this split, but him rising up to that number 1, number 2 mid lane ranking in the NACL, should really get him some LCS looks next year, and I think this continues to show that off. Saligo was certainly not a pushover in the mid lane, and Shochi was definitely better by a large margin in this series. And then, the other 2 remaining members of Fear, I think, also really stepped up in this series. Not that all 5 of them didn't, but Perry and Manui in particular, I thought were awesome in this series. Perry just had full control of the jungle going into Keel, who, is one of the best junglers in the league. I know that people criticize him for not being able to play some of the more meta picks, but I think he's honestly underrated in that aspect, or at least he has been over the course of this split. Has had a couple of bad games here or there. The one against FlyQuest definitely stands out, but Perry definitely out-jungled him in this series. Manui was awesome, super aggressive, willing to make plays. We know that he plays off the rest of this team incredibly well. Shochi likes to go for those aggressive AD mid laners, as we saw in this series, and Manui is more than happy, in fact, more than comfortable, to play some AP bot laners, to play some mages down there. He's a very versatile player. Both of them have some of the biggest champion pools in the NACL, full stop, especially for their positions. And it really does complement each other well. Manui, I think, both splits now has just gotten better every game. It feels like as he gets more comfortable playing with his team, and as he gets more confident in his play, he plays a lot better, and the talent and the mechanical skill has definitely shown through. JJ, I think, has been really good for this team. Really like him as a player. I've always liked JJ. I've always been very high on him on this channel. Hasn't necessarily been a superstar for this team, but I think has filled in for this role nicely. A couple of really good engages this game, especially on the Nautilus in game 1. And this was one of Philip's better series in a while. I think Philip has struggled a little bit individually in terms of the 1v1 lane matchups in the top lane, but I think this was fantastic. He was better than Zamudo by a big margin, got 2 games of Renekton, a champion that I really like him on, and I think really does play towards a lot of his strengths. It gives him some agency in the early game, and I think he took advantage of it. Just a really good series overall for Fear, quite frankly. And then for Wildcard on the other side, kind of disappointing that you weren't able to take a game in this series. I don't want to overreact because I really do value Fear incredibly highly. I don't think that they're a team where you can say like, oh, we lost 0-2 to them, we must not be very good. Like, Fear is just better than that reputation at this point, but Wildcard's probably a team that doesn't want to be going out 0-2 in the first round of the playoffs with how they've performed up until this split. They've really relied on the top side of their map, in my opinion, especially Keel and Saligo to be able to do a lot for them in a lot of their wins, and both of them just were not nearly as proactive and solid as their counterparts, but I don't think they were the biggest problems in this series. My dud of the series is going to go to Lens in the bot lane. I just want to see more out of him. I've been, you know, kind of neutral on him throughout the entire split. I think there's been really good moments, and I think there's been bad moments, and there are games where he's just completely irrelevant. It's obviously tougher in the NACL when there really is no way to just individually track everything that happens in a lane matchup, but I don't notice Lens nearly as much as I notice any other AD carry in the entire league. He's not nearly as aggressive in team fights, plays a lot safer, and the team doesn't necessarily play for him as much. I don't think his laning has been all that good, and I think that kind of stuff is highlighted when you go up against a really good team like Fear. I think Donbray's fine, but I don't think he's been all that great this split either. I think bot lane has certainly been the weakness for Wildcard, and I think that was a little bit exploited here. Zamudo also had a pretty bad series. A game of Ornn, game of Poppy, 2 tanks, and so I'm not going to, you know, rage on him too hard for not necessarily being the biggest factor in playing from behind, but they actually had some opportunities to be able to at least do something in game number 1, and it really didn't feel like they were ever all that relevant after 10 minutes, and I think Zamudo losing in the top lane matchup where Fear has been relatively exploitable over the course of this split, not necessarily because Philip is bad, but because the team doesn't necessarily play for it. I think it's just disappointing, and so for Wildcard, you're probably going to be heading into the lower bracket feeling disappointed. Hopefully you can figure stuff out because this is not really a team that should be going out early in playoffs. But for Fear, massive win. It doesn't get easier from here. I'm going to be saying that a lot for basically everybody that wins in round number 1. If you're getting out and getting into that winner's round number 2, it's going to be a tough matchup basically no matter what. But Fear is a big part of that tough matchup because they are a legit top team. And then moving on now to our third series of round 1, our kind of lower half of the bracket, if you will, not the lower bracket. I know that's a weird way for me to put it, but of course, this is going to be the second half of the first round, which means that these two teams, the winners of these 2 games, are going to face off each other, and the losers of these 2 games are going to face off against each other in round number 2. And so, let's go ahead and get into it. We had a match between the number 2 seeded FlyQuest Challengers and the number 7 seeded Evil Geniuses Challengers that FlyC was able to take. They absolutely should be the better team in a series like this, although it was a little bit closer than maybe you would expect. Both of these games were pretty back and forth from Evil Geniuses. A couple of good moments coming out from them, and as per usual, this is a team that looks relatively good against one of the better teams in the league. That's what Evil Geniuses has kind of been known to do, is compete against teams that are better than them and not compete against teams that are worse than them, and I think they absolutely did continue that here. One thing to note before we jump into the analysis, Armeo is in the jungle position. He was not in the regular season at all, and that is because it seems like Shaden has been promoted to the main roster. He did play in the final week of LCS action, and he did really well. He looked really good and a lot more consistent, I think, than what Armeo was looking towards the back half of the split, and so it looks like that's going to be a permanent substitution for Evil Geniuses moving into the playoffs, so Armeo taking the place of Shaden here in the jungle. I actually think this could be a change that ends up helping out both teams. I'm not exactly sure that that's going to be the case, but Armeo is a bit of consistency added to a team that has really struggled with consistency, and of course, Shaden, I think, gives that main roster team some energy and some fire that I think they could really use to play off of Jojo Pune that they've kind of been looking for. But for now, talking about, you know, the Challengers team, they actually did put up a relatively decent fight in this series, topside especially. I think there was one major problem, though, and we'll talk about it as a positive for FlyQuest here, and that was bot lane. Just a major series coming in from Masu and Winsome, and at this point, there really is no denying just how good these two are. Masu was the best AD carry in the NACL in Spring Split for my money. I know that there were a lot of different options. Unforgiven was definitely in that conversation. I mean, you could go a lot of different ways. I think a player like Spawn played really well once he was back in the NACL, but Masu was the king of that position for basically every opportunity that he had that he wasn't on Wi-Fi, especially. Even when he was on Wi-Fi, he was still dominating, and it hasn't quite been as dominant of a summer split, but that's only because the expectation was like the best player in the NACL by a gigantic margin, but that hasn't necessarily been the case. He's still maybe been the best AD carry in the NACL. Like, it certainly is a conversation you can have, but expectations were even higher than that, and so I can see why some people are being like, not necessarily the spring split, right? Because it's not as much of a standout, but, I mean, he's still gonna have games where he's just, like, the best player on the Rift without any sort of, like, competition, really, at all. I still think he's the best prospect that we have in North America in terms of looking towards the future. I think that he could potentially be, like, a player that ends up as a #1 or #2 AD carry in the LCS in the next couple of years, and I really don't think he's all that far off from it right now. Like, he could absolutely fill into an LCS team and be more than capable at the current moment, but I think FlyQuest is, you know, kind of waiting to give him the keys to the kingdom to be, like, that #1 ADC guy that I think they know he can be. And Winsome is certainly no slouch either. I think he's the best support in the NACL. I think they're the best bot lane in the NACL, and they definitely showed up in this series. Loved the Kog'Maw pick in game #1. I actually think Kog'Maw is relatively underplayed in the current meta. It's basically Kai'Sa. Like, it really is. It's not quite as safe and it's not quite as efficient, but the damage is absolutely there. If you play AP Cog, like, it will absolutely shred, and you've got a ton of range to be able to do a lot with it. You actually might be getting more consistent damage out of AP Cog. It's just at the cost of, you know, a little bit of the aggression and the playmaking that you can make with the Kai'Sa, which I think a lot of teams would probably take over the Kog'Maw, but it's worth noting that, like, this pick is super viable, and Masu definitely proved that in the series. He's player of the game, by the way, player of the series. I don't know if I said that, but if I didn't, there you go. He absolutely was fantastic, and he really was the standout. Winsome was also really good, first on the Leona in game 1, and then the Braum in game 2. Braum, every single time it's picked, feels like it is ridiculously oppressive to play into, basically in any region that we've seen it so far. It's really raised my opinion of that champion a ton. I used to just think of it as more of a passive pick that you play when you want to enable your AD carry, but Braum can, like, single-handedly carry games against certain team comps. When you're playing into Misfortune, like, yeah, Braum can carry a game. When you're playing into Ahri, yeah, Braum can carry a game. It's pretty darn good in those particular circumstances. So, Matsu and Winsome continuing to play well. Spyrax continues to be awesome. He has really just, like, reignited in the second half of this split. I was actually getting a little bit worried about him. His performances in spring and at the first half of summer really weren't, you know, up to what I was expecting from him, but, like, the second half of summer split, he's arguably been the best or the second best mid laner in the NACL. Shochi and Harry are the other two that I think you're going to have in that conversation, but Spyrax has been phenomenal over the second half, so much so that he got a start in the LCS, which he probably should have continued to get. Kind of an interesting choice, but I understand wanting to go to Vikla at least to close out the year, but he was really good again in this series, even if Ryoma on the other side was also a positive. Faiso and Yuji, maybe not quite as oppressive. I think Yuji did have a good series, but he's arguably been the MVP for me across this season so far, or at least this split in the NACL, so was looking for kind of a dominant performance, and it was just a good one from him. Faiso continues to struggle for FlyQuest in the top lane, at least in the isolated 1v1s, going into a player in Surti who has been awesome for this team and was awesome in Spring Split as well for another really bad team, and so I feel really bad for him as a player, but, you know, I think the bot lane was just too much to be able to overcome, and that's going to be a trend, I think, for a lot of FlyQuest games. And then for Evil Geniuses on the other side, their bot lane, which has really been a big positive for them, I think really let them down in this series. King is going to get my dud of the series, and he's been the best player on Evil Geniuses by a large margin. He's probably the biggest reason why this team is in playoffs to begin with, and they've been competitive, I think, with a lot of top teams. King has actually been able to step up and do a lot in those matchups. I was really talking about him as a player who was maybe the #1, #2 performance-wise AD carry in the NACL this split. Obviously, I would still take a player like Masu ahead of him, but King was really good, and he was really hot going into this tournament, and so to see him have such a really bad first performance, I think is very disappointing. He was easily the worst player across this series. He did nothing on the MF. The Braum completely shut down that pick, and the Xayah game in game 1 was just completely outplayed. Like, he was not very good. He was stepping too far forward, not necessarily being in a good position. Just not a good series. Smoothie wasn't particularly helping him, but I don't think he really played all that bad. I think it really was King that really let this team down, in my opinion, because everybody else was relatively fine. I really like Surti in the top lane. I think if you put a really good team around him, he might be like a top 2, 3 top laner in the NACL, and that's a hard thing to do. There are so many good top laners in the NACL, but I really like what I've seen from Surti on tape pretty much every time he's been able to play at this level. I think Armeo did fill in rather well. He paired up with Ryoma well. Ryoma had to be very aggressive in this series, and sometimes it was punished, but for the most part, I would consider that a positive, and I would say that he was a big factor. I think if King actually stepped up and was a little bit more clinical in this series, they could have at the very least won a game, maybe even won the series. That really was the big difference maker. breaker was the bot gap, and I think that's very disappointing for Evil Geniuses. They're really going to rely on that bot lane to be able to continue to win games, but they're moving down to the lower bracket now, and so they've got to put this behind them and get their confidence back. And then for FlyQuest on the other side, Masu and Winsome are simply just too good. Spyrax is also fantastic. Yuji might be the MVP. Faisal, we know how talented he is, even if he hasn't been able to put it together as much for Fly as he did for Fear last split. FlyQuest is just a very difficult team to beat, and I think they absolutely have to, at the very least, be considered one of the best teams in the NACL at the moment. And then moving on to our final series of round 1 here, and it was a pretty intriguing matchup, at least on paper. One of these teams surging, and the other team, you know, doing well, but maybe not as well as one would hope. We had DSG disguised taking on AOE Gold. And DSG does take this series. This one was not close, really, at all. I tried to hype it up at least a little bit. I tried to make you think, oh, maybe we finally didn't get a 2-0 in round number 1. Maybe we didn't just get 8 games, 8-0 across the top seeds in each series. But no, we got 8-0 across the top seeds in each series, and this series was by far the least close, even with Team Liquid versus Maryville existing. I somehow think this was even more of a blowout, which is very disappointing, because I like AOE. I think that they were actually playing pretty well towards the back half of the regular season. Maybe not a team that I think could compete with the top 5, which just feel really locked in right now, but definitely felt like the best of the rest. You know, maybe them and Evil Geniuses felt like the really only 2 teams that could compete with any of the teams in the top 5, but DSG just made such quick work of them in this series. Really not close. Player of the series, give it to basically anybody on DSG. They dominated this one so hard. I'm going to give it to Fake God in the top lane. Thought he played really, really well in this one, and you can't give him Rumble. This pick is so ridiculously broken on the current patch. I was surprised to not see more teams picking it up. I understand that it can be a little bit volatile, and especially with the way that current team construction is, maybe it's sometimes hard to fit an AP top laner into your composition. If you do want to go for something like a Maokai in the jungle, I do understand that, you know, you're kind of putting yourself in a weird position there, but AD mid laners are super good right now, and so, you know, like, I definitely think that Rumble is still something that should be highly prioritized by basically every team in the league, but we saw it get through pick ban multiple times throughout this week, which was just kind of concerning to me. But Fake God definitely not letting that one go through pick and ban. He got it in both games, and man, did he dominate in both games. He very well is the best top laner in the NACL at the current moment, and, you know, I think that it is debatable. I think Bradley is a really, really good player, and I think you could definitely make the argument for him as well, but Fake God has just been on a different level basically throughout 2023. He was great on Cloud9 in spring. He's been really good on DSG here in summer. I would argue even better, and I think he's going to continue to be a massive positive. I've loved Fake God as a player for so long now. I remember hyping him up so much in 19, when that 100 Thieves team was super struggling, and he got put in over Someday, and people were all pissed off because obviously he should have never been in the lineup over Someday, but they had to make room for Ryu, you know, etc., etc., whatever ended up happening there. I thought Fake God was still a really good player, and I was really excited to see him get an opportunity in the LCS for real on Dignitas. Unfortunately, that team was just kind of a disaster all over the place, and so he didn't necessarily look as good as I think he could have. But I think if he got another shot on a team that actually had talent around him, I think he could look relatively decent. He's been dominating in Tier 2, and so I would expect he would get a similar kind of reaction in the LCS. And then Young is the other player that you really have to point out. 16-0-10 on 2 Assassins. Really good series from Young. He's actually been, like, quietly crazy consistent, and that was the big problem with Young, is especially at the beginning part of last split, he was so good, and I was really excited when he got some time in the LCS because he was playing so well at the NACL level, and I was like, man, you know, Young could be like an LCS caliber mid now, and he's looking pretty solid. He definitely trailed off as the split went on. It felt like he got a lot less consistent from game to game, and that was what I was worried about with him coming to DSG, with a player like Meech also being relatively inconsistent from game to game, at least in that respect. I think that, you know, I was worried about this team not necessarily living up to their hype in every game, and while that has been true, it's not because of Young, and I think that's the big takeaway and the big positive. Young is still a really good mid lane prospect in the NACL, somebody who is probably top 4-ish, probably around there in the NACL at the current moment in the mid lane, and I think that's more than good enough for this team to be able to win with. He dominated Darkwings in this series. I hated the drafts from AOE, and Young absolutely took advantage of them. Meech and Zazel were great. Tomio just ran the map. I mean, did absolutely everything he needed to do in this series. DSG was just dominant. They were the best team by a large margin. And then for AOE, just kind of an unfortunate series. I really like some of the players on this team. Will, in particular, is just so crazy good, and he has been so good. Not only this split, which, yes, he has been really good this split. He's almost single-handedly carried this AOE team through multiple different wins throughout this split, but, I mean, we've known Will has been one of the best prospects in North America for, what, like 3 years now? 2 years? Go back to the Dignitas days. Then he got his chance on 100 Thieves, and he was really good there. Now he's here on AOE and the Golden Guardians, technically in the Golden Guardians organization, I should say, and he's absolutely been the best player on a team that has very much overperformed my expectations for them. He was really good in Game 2 on the Viego, but also that draft was completely set up for him to fail because he was the only AD threat in the entire comp, and he really had to step up, or they were never going to be able to win that game. And even if he did play well, it certainly wasn't enough to be able to pick up the win. The Ivern game in game number 1 was significantly worse. It's genuinely one of the worst Ivern games I've seen in Pro up until this point, which is super disappointing. I just don't think it's Will's playstyle really at all, and Darkwings was really bad. The Lissandra in Game 2, I get it. Like, it's really good into LeBlanc. It's the quote-unquote counterpick matchup, but then don't pick Ziggs. You can't have both of these in the lineup. They're not complementary really at all in terms of how they want to play the game, and I think Darkwings really suffered for it. He did not have a good series. Lynx wasn't great. Breezy continued to try to make plays even when the team was super far behind, which usually I'm gonna compliment and I'm gonna give props to, but in this case, there was just a lot of bad engages coming out from him. That's another player that I think has been really good over the course of Summer Split. And then Concept in the top lane. I'm low on Concept. I don't think that's going to surprise anybody. Not a good series. Fake God was so oppressive in this series. And Cassante, Scion, 2 tanks that just aren't going to be able to survive against Rumble. And survive he did not do in this series. I think you could give this to Darkwings. I think you could give this to Breezy. But for me, Concept is going to get the dud of the series. And for AOE, this was just a very disappointing performance. I don't know if they came into the series with the expectation of being able to win it, but they definitely came in with the expectation of being able to hold their own. DSG has certainly not been the most consistent of the top teams throughout this split. I would argue Team Liquid and FlyQuest were clearly more consistent than them in the regular season, and then a team like Fear is obviously really scary. Even Wildcard can be entirely scary. I think DSG definitely had some holes in terms of their game plans, and AOE just completely crumbled against them, and I think that's really disappointing. Hopefully they can kind of figure this out and go into the lower bracket in a better state, because this was a bad performance, and if they play like this again, they're not going to win a series in the playoffs, which I think would be really disappointing to this team. But for DSG, they move on. They really shouldn't have ever been in danger talent-wise. They are just better than AOE, and they should be able to take them down, but you know, there's always going to be some question marks with this team because of the inherent inconsistency of some of their younger players, but I think a really good performance and a dominating series from them here in round 1. All right, but that is going to do it for my NACL Round 1 overview and analysis video for the summer playoffs. Up on the screen now, you're going to see the updated NACL playoff bracket. We've obviously got our winners Round 2 up on the screen and our losers Round 1, if you will, up on the screen. Usually this is the part where I would do the preview, but because of just how fast-paced and how crammed I think a lot of this schedule is, and just the way that these videos are structured, I'm not going to be previewing any of these games because 2 of these series have already happened as this is coming out. Again, no spoilers in this. We'll get to that later in the week in a separate video, but in lower bracket, I think it's do or die for every single team, and I'm really interested to hear what you guys' thoughts are on these series down in the comment section below. What teams are impressing you? What teams aren't impressing you? I'd love to know your thoughts. What players are you really looking forward to, especially in the NACL? It really is all about player development more than individual success, and I'd really be interested to hear what players you're really high on and what players are really standing out to you in terms of potential, you know, future LCS players. I'd love to know maybe some out-of-the-box ones that maybe I haven't mentioned nearly as much. I'm glad if we have a little bit of a different opinion. If there's a player that I'm maybe lower on that you're higher on, I'd love to hear about that as well. But if you are enjoying the video, I'd really appreciate it if you did leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people. Of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. I don't only post about the NACL on this channel, but I do post about every single NACL game, and so if you're interested in the NACL, hit sub. If you're interested in any of the 4 major regions as well, I cover all of those in every single stage that they go through on this channel as well, and especially with playoffs kicking up basically everywhere around the world at the current moment. You know, you want to get a good idea of how these Worlds teams from the major regions are looking moving into Worlds qualification. This is a good place for that. I've covered every single game from every major region this year, so go ahead and hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when some of that playoff coverage ends up going live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.